welcome to my presentation today. As Peter has introduced, I am Daphne and I'm a first-year PhD student from the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa. I really do thank all of you all for joining me here today, especially during a very busy time during December, so I really do appreciate that. And of course, as Peter has mentioned, this is the project that was funded by a MyTax Research Training Award Grant. And for those who are not aware, but I'm sure most of you are aware that MyTax is a funding agency in Canada. And I started this project under my supervisor, Peter, back in September 2020. So social innovation is a research area that I'm very, very passionate about, and is a type of research project that I'd like to pursue more for my PhD and for my PhD dissertation as well. So this project is focused on examining the progression and influence of social innovation initiatives in two Canadian universities. And just as a heads up, due to the ethics of this project, I will not be sharing the name of the initiatives or any kind of personal information of the participants from the study. So the aims and objectives for this webinar is divided into three parts. First, I will be talking about the background information on which I will present the research question that frames the study, the theoretical frameworks, the data set, and the analysis methods. Secondly, I will present the preliminary results from case 1 and 2, followed by the third part on the discussion of the preliminary results. So welcome to part 1 on the background information. So the research question that is central to this research project is how to select social innovation. So from here onwards, I'm going to refer to social innovation as SI, initiatives emerge, develop, and influence change in the institutional regime. So in brackets, this refers to conventions, norms, beliefs, policies, and practices within the university, while also striving to effect positive social impacts that are beyond the university as well. So in the slide, I wanted to present the working definition of SI and the ways that SI initiatives may go about delivering their initiative within the broader SI ecosystem. So SI is the development and implementation of novel interventions, processes, programs, products, or models to meet social needs. Now you may wonder, what are some social needs of a society? This can range really from anything, but for example, certain examples include health, health awareness, poverty reduction, or job employment opportunities to those who are new to a country. Services of SI can include centers, labs, hubs, incubators, and programs. Significantly, these have become very common outlets of SI in campuses across Canada within the last 10 years. So there are two theoretical frameworks that are very important to the research question. These include SI process theory and the multi-level framework. The first part of the research question asks, how do SI initiatives operate during its stages of development within the institutional regime? These two frameworks help to frame the goal of answering this research question. In terms of SI process theory, Mulligan 2006 presents 4 stages. This includes starting, developing, sustaining, and institutionalizing. Starting an initiative refers to generating ideas to kickstart an initiative, and developing refers to testing and piloting those ideas. Sustaining refers to assessing what needs to be achieved to scale the initiative forward. And institutionalizing refers to the ways in which the initiative learns and evolves. And in this project, it means also connecting its initiative to the university. So these processes serve the basis for the codes to code the data for this project. The second framework is the multi-level framework, which is inspired by Giles. In connection to innovation systems, Giles discusses about how innovation functions in a critical manner within a niche. For example, in this case, it would be this SI, and the regime, which is in this case, the university. Giles states that innovative systems function and co-evolve in an adaptive system. As this project is focused on SI initiatives, The SI is a part of the institution, also known as the regime. And these come with certain rules that include regulative, normative, and cognitive rules. Normative, I would say, is the most associated with SI initiatives as it highlights norms, role expectations, duties, rights, and responsibilities, which is very much in relation to the regime as it is determined by rules and conventions which formulate the belief systems of the regime. In contrast to the niche, it is a space for coming together. In contrast, the niche is a space for coming together collectively to co-create change within the regime. And this framework was used for coding the data as well. So this is a type of socio-ecological model that presents various levels of the SI in a meso, micro, and macro level scale. The inner structure reveals the processes of how an SI initiative would unfold within a niche level. So note that the white swirl represents the processes, and the gray swirl represents how leadership is achieved simultaneously with the processes of SI. The institutionalizing process is the one process that makes a connection between the niche and the regime. Surrounding the niche is a larger level, also known as the regime or the university. However, outside of the regime are pressures that also affect the regime, and consequently, these effects have an impact between the relationship between the regime and the niche. This broader project also incorporates leadership processes that are running parallel to the processes, and it will be a type of topic that will be discussed in another presentation. So you may be wondering where the data set is coming from. So this project draws from a larger project conducted by the principal investigator, Dr. Peter Milley and Dr. Barbara Ciarto, that maps out leadership in two initiatives within the context of Canada. So I analyzed a total of 16 semi-structured interviews with actors from SI initiatives. Furthermore, I did a primary analysis of publicly available data in order to understand and map out the chronological order of events that took place for the SI initiatives. So this is a little bit of information for you all to see regarding the dissections of the SI initiatives. I refer to the cases according to case 1 and 2. Both cases are located in two very distinct cities in Canada. Case 1 is a little older, being established in 2009, and whereas case 2 was established in 2013. Case 1 is affiliated with a graduate school, whereas case 2 is affiliated with a business school. The aims and objectives for case 1 is about envisioning futuristic change, and case 2 aims to respond to social issues with a goal to actually transform the economy. The funding for case 1 and 2 comes from internal and external sources. Many external sources for funding was evident for case 2. So the analysis methods for the study were determined by two phases. In phase 1, Dr. Peter Milley and I pilot tested a coding framework in which I coded the interviews with the assistance of NVivo. Once the coding of the data was completed, I applied a matrix coding for case 1 and 2 and created subthemes. Lastly, I connected the information I collected from publicly available data and merged them into the interview data. Phase 2 involved a preliminary analysis of certain themes that came out of the data based on the triangulation of data. Though this is preliminary, I did make certain comparisons while I was doing the analysis between C1 and C2. However, the information about comparing that across case comparative analysis is not really the focus of this presentation, but will be in future presentations of this project. As you can see from the slide, the coding framework is presented as a process where the codes were developed in order to understand how the cases went from its starting phase to its niche regime interaction phase. However, we were aware that in the midst of going through various phases, there could be tensions in the SI initiatives developing internal or external influence. So on the right hand of the screen, you can see how when an initiative is transitioning from its starting to its sustaining phase, the SI initiative could be driven early on to create external influence. However, if an SI initiative is within its institutionalizing phase and is confronted with the niche regime, the SI could be driven to make more internal influence. So we wanted to see if this coding framework and the rationality for this would match up with the data. So now welcome to part 2 of the presentation on the preliminary results. So in this section, I present the results according to the phases of the cases, as well as the influence the cases seeks to make. So on this slide, the starting of an initiative will be presented. So this was the least represented process from the preliminary data. However, for C1, certain ideas that came out of the participants include discussions of how to start C1 prior to starting it, and the founding of the initiative based on certain visions. Whereas for C2, there was a bit more discussion in terms of when the initiative started, recognizing the skills of the actors in the SI initiative, branding the initiative, as well as the vision to create an SI ecosystem. In the developing stage of an SI initiative, C1 actors discussed about the importance of developing a network and having good inner initiative community practiced, followed by the importance to create a funding network. So similarly to C2, the funding support in terms of the internal funding was also another important aspect of developing an SI initiative, followed by understanding what works and does not work for the initiative ecosystem. So sustaining an initiative is where I began to see much more data. The preliminary results for C1, sustaining initiative, is expressed through 4 types of ways. These include 1, communicating and interacting with the right people, having the right mindset, and being cautious of the branding of the initiative. Receiving support was a large discussion in terms of funding support and general support, followed by certain approaches to take. For C2, funding was the largest type of sustaining code that was expressed in terms of how to get funding, sources of funding, the struggles of funding, as well as the awareness of funding the components of the initiative. Certain discussions in C2 also discussed finding the right allies, staying true to the DNA of the initiative, the work ethics and values and visions in the initiative. With institutionalizing an initiative, C1 had a bit more reflection. Institutionalizing for C1 means establishing a think space in terms of a think tank for students. This includes students engaging in research, students working cross-sectorally within the university, providing education help to students, students engaging in SI concepts and approaches, and working towards making sure that students have access to work opportunities by getting certain skills. Institutionalizing for C1 was also expressed by the reputation of the initiative in terms of international program reputation and ensuring there is self-credit for the success. In terms of C2, institutionalizing an initiative was expressed through being a service to students in terms of research and credit courses, institutional capital, and the ideas that institutional connection needs to come with funding, difficulty in connecting with the faculty core, and helping the university. The niche regime interaction was coded according to what the initiative felt like being within the niche and being associated with the regime. So for C1, in terms of the niche concentration, this was discussed by the actors in terms of developing a shared space and creating a student-focused niche where students can feel like they are part of the niche developing process. With regards to the niche regime interaction, institutional partnership was highlighted as something important. However, there were other references to how there was a lack of support from the university and a lack of recognition from the university as well. For C2, unlike C1, there was reference to self-metaphorical descriptions. In terms of being in the niche, there's also discussion of how there are struggles in the niche. In terms of the connection with the regime, there are certain references with regards to having connection with the university, having a good relationship, but also how it can be troubling and how these two feelings balance out, as well as about finding the right allies. Internal influence refers to the ways that the initiative works to have a social impact on the university. Creating internal influence within the university for C1 and C2 is discussed in terms of doing it for the institution as well as within the initiative. In terms of internal influence within the university for C1, there was generally a lack of impact in terms of making change in the institution. However, as a side note, one of the important aspects Peter and I discussed about in terms of making an internal influence for the university is in the way that the initiative strives to make the idea of social innovation more well known to the institution and to the students who are associated with it as well. And again, the internal influence within the initiative is about making an impact for the students, in which they become aware of how to navigate the SI space. For C2, internal influence within the university is discussed in terms of ensuring progressive ideas within the institution, making an impact for students, and socializing a vision by change by reaching out to students, which is similarly discussed to C1. Internal influence within the initiative is discussed in reference to internal values, which means recognizing judgment and bias, and creating ideas for improving the internal in order to change the external. And finally, external influence for C1 is referenced to creating a community of practice in terms of networking, developing progressive goals for society, and hosting public events. For C2, reaching out to a community is a way to influence external change. So this was discussed in terms of helping out vulnerable communities, and then also discussing about how to approach like a variety of communities at the same time. So helping students, alumni, and vulnerable communities, but also in the difficulty of helping out a community as well. And of course, fostering the entrepreneurial community. So I wanted to discuss with you all the larger themes that come out of the data for case 1 and 2. I will discuss them through the processes and through the influence the initiatives are trying to reach. For C1, specifically in terms of starting an initiative, founding the initiative based on ideas was the most popular reference. The target population for the initiative includes students, SI partners, as well as the faculty. The purpose of founding the initiative was based on developing skills and practice in order to lead systemic design research, get grants in order to do research, and social responsibility by understanding change. In developing an SI initiative, funding network was referenced as an important aspect in developing C1. Developing a funding network for C1 means to develop networks in order to grow funding, as well as testing ideas. For sustaining an initiative, C1 referenced 1, having the right mindset, and 2, that funding support is vital to increase the longevity of C1. Having the right mindset is discussed in terms of what works and what doesn't work, and if things don't work, how does the initiative go about learning to embrace its challenges? In addition, it means having a shared set of values, as well as establishing and creating principles that can be embodied in the SI initiative. This includes social and economic responsibility. As mentioned earlier, funding support is another highly referenced factor in sustaining an initiative. Funding support for an initiative means more research, which in the larger light means helping to develop projects that were already which also means developing, innovation faster, as well as continuing projects that were already established in the developing stage. However, the kinds of issues that arise for C1 due to a lack of funding includes issues about keeping working staff, which therefore has an effect on the longevity of labs. The need to reach out externally for funding takes a lot of time from what is also important. Therefore, it affects the choices to do projects, which consequently are, they become smaller in nature. So in terms of institutionalizing an initiative, establishing the SI as a think tank for students presented to be a very highly relevant factor in institutionalizing C1 into the university. A think space for students includes having students being engaged in the SI thinking space, developing skills in terms of business leadership, as well as using their skills to build on the core visions of C1. Furthermore, this is advanced by academic learning, and the goal for C1 is to eventually have the students be engaged in research, which could potentially lead students to getting hired in the initiative. Within the niche regime interaction, there was much talk about the niche regime aspect in terms of how C1 faces a lot of support, faces a lot of lack of support from the university. And this means that C1 has to survive, on its own at certain times, which therefore has an effect on sustaining the initiative and not being able to really connect in projects between the regime and the niche. In terms of internal influence for C1, it is about getting funds to do projects, as well as ensuring to sustain the graduate program that is tied to the core of the university. And for external influence, C1 is about helping undertake, research projects to help advance society, as well as train students in the grad program, which could be helpful for students so that they could see the SI through the lens of research or entrepreneurial work. And lastly, networking is another type of external influence visioned by C1. So now we're on case 2. In terms of starting an initiative, creating an ecosystem for learning and networking seemed to have a prominence in the data. So the vision for C2 when they started was to be a type of social innovation initiative that is known for social venture incubation and student incubation as well. Developing an SI initiative was discussed in terms of developing the SI space, and this includes creating lab work, experiential opportunities, and opportunities for students as well. However, it is important to note that the dimensions of SI are significantly determined by funding. Sustaining an initiative for C2 is expressed in terms of funding, work ethics, and values, as well as in terms of visions for the future. Work ethics and values is highlighted in blue due to the larger amount of references to this factor in sustaining C2. So funding is an important aspect of sustaining C2. However, there are struggles of getting funding in terms of getting permanent funding, as well as having enough donor funders, as well in order to sustain social venture incubation and SI labs. In addition, keeping the sources of funding in mind is valuable in order to be aware of who is funded, as well as knowing the effect and significance of it on the entirety of C2. Work ethic and values was seen as a very important factor in helping to sustain an initiative. So specifically in terms of questioning how they work. So this means for C2 to ask how are they creating an inclusive working environment and making sure that the principle of board discipline is being respected. So this refers to reporting back, or in other words, having a well-defined feedback strategy. Work ethics and values for C2 also involves acknowledging working with multiple approaches in order to create change, as well as how their working style is helping students. Visions for the future was another important factor in terms of creating an inclusive space, as well as being a space that is open to developing work opportunities for students. Institutionalizing an SI initiative in C2 means that though there is student engagement with labs, there is significant difficulty in how the initiative goes about proposing more academic related interventions that are beyond the core ideas of the universities. The issues that are created as a result of this problem includes gaps in the faculty linkages between C2 and the university, a disconnect in engaging in more student-led engagement where the goal is for students to be more collaborated with a larger range of SI actors and entrepreneurship. And lastly, if C2 has insisted on having postdoc opportunities, they have seen like a type of setback of having supervisory support for postdoc opportunities. In terms of the niche regime interaction for C2, having a connection with the university through service seemed to be a very reoccurring theme for C2. So what does this mean? The data revealed that it meant like satisfying the university with student satisfaction through education and training, as well as ensuring that there is going to be satisfaction to the bigger schools in the institution in terms of innovation and change making. So C2 expressed the concerns of this with reference to how the work of the university is really at the center of the university and how they feel more as an outsider to the university in the sense that if they can make decisions freely, if they're allowed to do that, would that be approved if it actually allows having the institution involved in those actions? So in terms of making an internal influence, C2 presented that ensuring progressive ideas within the core of the institution and how C2 is about influencing the institution at the end of the day. So an example of this would be the idea of decolonization. In addition, making an impact for the student is seen as a very important step for C2 as well. This was discussed in reference to sustaining students that goes beyond credit courses and ensuring that the students feel a sense of community with one another, as well as making sure that the students are able to build their skills in order to have an important say as important stakeholders in decision making. So for external influence for C2, models or logic to achieve external influence is referenced with regards to entrepreneurial traction and the hiring process, as well as gathering a great community, an SI community. Entrepreneurial attraction means that if entrepreneurs can help in labs, this means that they have access to perhaps getting equity investment, which also means that they could perhaps help reach out to more external influence by helping out vulnerable communities. Also, this means that if C2 can encourage social enterprise learning and making this connection into larger schools, such as a business school, that are part of the institution, that can help attract more social entrepreneurs. The hiring process is expressed by making sure to hire the right people for the job in order to build a closer and comfortable relationship between the SI initiative and with its communities, which can be seen as a step towards systemic change. Another aspect of this means recruiting vulnerable members of a vulnerable community to a lab as a way to engage in creating solutions which they may understand more organically. And lastly, gathering a great SI community refers to the importance for C2 to take a greater leadership role as conveners in bringing SI actors into community events. Significantly, this is seen to bring an SI ecosystem leadership within Canada. So welcome to the last part of this presentation, which is the discussion of the preliminary results. So I would like to highlight the research question again, which asks, how do select SI initiatives emerge, develop, and influence change in the institutional regime while striving to affect positive social impacts beyond the university? So, as you can see, I do ask the question, are SIs think tanks? So the reason I ask this question is because of the interconnection between these three elements that are very significant to SI initiatives, which include the regime, the niche, and the influence aspects that the SI initiative needs to consider. In the case of C1 and C2, the unfolding of the SI initiatives as they progress within the institutional regime is a challenging playground. For example, when the niche and regime interact, there's a really fundamental tension, which really is in reference to how these SI initiatives confront the idea of inward and outward influence, and how do they balance those two out. So with the SI initiatives already being bound to the internal regime or hanging off the institution, it means that they are significantly in service to the institution. So at the end of the day, does this mean that the niche is a place where the SI initiative are being treated as a core to the university, or are they operating more or less as a service to the university? Significantly, this confronts the question of whether the SI initiative is regime or niche focused. So now when the two factors of niche and influence interact, C1 and C2 want to do this by growing the initiative as well as expanding the activities, which means seeking larger amounts of funding resources. As we work towards the right side of this diagram, achieving influence for the niche also means that internal funding is not enough. Therefore, C1 and C2 have to apply externally for grants, and these funding sources place a lot of pressure, which can affect the growth and activities by the initiatives in the niche environment. So now when we merge the regime and influence, the regime of the institution is heavily focused on ensuring that the requirements to the academic core is fulfilled. And another important question from this project for me is the regime open to expanding these academic terrains even further beyond the regime and allow more space for the SI initiative to propose ideas? So now there are tensions that are presented in this model of the relationship between the niche and regime, and how influence is very much an important factor between these two areas of the niche and the regime. So overall, the process that happened for the SI initiatives is very complex and multifaceted, and is a growing area of research that can be further advanced, and is one that I wish to contribute to. I really want to thank you all so much for sitting here doing my webinar and learning about a research project conducted on examining SI initiative processes within an institutional regime. Thank you so much. This project has been a very amazing experience for me, and I'm really looking forward to learning so much more and taking this project ahead. Thank you. So I have my references, and now I am open to questions.